for diligently preparing them. I appreciate that. Yeah. Do you want to have your laptop to even look at them? You probably can. Yeah. Yeah. But I do think we should. We're 2 minutes after. Yeah. Can you speak here? We'll be sitting here. We have table tents we're about to put up. You're in the second tent right now.
Could we have all the panelists for this first session to please come on stage and take a seat? No. We're going to start in a minute or two. Okay. Shall I start? All right. Shall I start? I just have to keep clicking the slide. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Okay. And then I'll look at you for timing. All right. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming here to help us collectively work together to leverage for this independent global stocktake session. As you know, the stocktake will be a key moment to raise ambition for the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, for mitigation, for adaptation, for finance, and in light of equity, also include the best available science. Non-party inputs are essentially one of the ways we can build up political momentum within the global stocktake to enhance national ambition as well as action. And importantly, we have to bring in the accountability and transparency to put and keep us all on track to 1.5 degrees. All of these elements make the global stocktake really critical. While some aspects of the global stocktake have been clearly predefined through earlier negotiations, and there were a lot of meetings last week, the structure and the content of the final output package, as well as the mechanisms to ensure the follow-through is all there for the outputs, those remain undefined. We heard yesterday at the GST panel that Cecilia was moderating in the Egypt Pavilion that the stocktake will only be successful with through the actions it can trigger. And that is why it is really critical to ensure that the findings of the stocktake are included to shape the transformational changes that would be needed for us to address the climate crisis. So we need to do 3 things. We have to build a bridge and link it to the robust and inclusive political phase, which will happen next year when we have the official global stocktake, with clear recommendations in order to drive climate action for this decade. We also need to have pathways for the translation back to the national and regional context and to help inform local climate action and ambition. And this can only be done through collective planning in advance and through action. So that is why there were a set of partners, including ClimateWorks Foundation, where I'm from. We launched the independent global stocktake with many of you here in this room in 2019. This consortium of civil society actors recognized the importance of having a strong stocktake to raise ambition, to support implementation, and it is critical that civil society play a role in contributing to this stocktake to help us with our climate goals. What we're trying to do through this independent global stocktake is to lift regional priorities through dedicated civil society hubs for Latin America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and West Africa. These regional work streams with the country partners, led by the country partners, are going to align and look through expectations of what is needed from the different regions coming from the countries, what is needed to strengthen the GST, and to help with the financing needed, with mitigation, with adaptation, and loss and damage, which will together help us with the transition we all have to look into. So we thank you for spending this evening with us, for your expertise and guidance in bringing your intelligence, your insights into this process so that we can collectively help with the global stocktake. So we have a series of panelists who are here to share with you updates, all of the work that has been happening and as we're preparing for next year. And before we begin all of these updates from the various groups, we are very delighted to have Cecilia, who is the Director of Intergovernmental Support and Collective Process at the UNFCCC. So Cecilia is going to share with us what is happening with the official global stocktake and what has happened last week and this week and what's in store for next year. So Cecilia, over to you, and you have about 5 minutes or so. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Surabi. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here and to participate out of the negotiation space that's taking up a lot of my energy and time at the moment. But I would just like to continue from where Surabi left. Indeed, the GST is a centerpiece of the Paris Agreement, and I think the success of how well not only we design, but we implement the processes to reach the first global stocktake are critical. And for me, central to this is the role of non-party stakeholders and ensuring that the inside process of negotiation and negotiating a robust GST is actually complemented and that non-party stakeholders have a crucial play in terms of shaping it. Because it's one thing to deliver a well-defined global stocktake in Dubai, but it's another to ensure that we are able to use it to ratchet the ambition that is required in order to bring real transformation at the local level. I would just like to highlight here that last week on Saturday, the conclusions at the SBs were very encouraging. I think there is, of course, a lot of work that has been achieved through the first technical dialogue and the second technical dialogue that was held here in Sharm el-Sheikh. And really, I'd like to commend Farhan and Herad for leading that work and leading us to a place where I do strongly feel that we are ready to move on to Technical Dialogue 3, and the technical dialogues being a central piece of the three core components of the GST in order of driving us not only to having that use of best science and equity, but also ensuring that the GST, the first GST, is going to be credible in terms of how we assess collective progress globally. But more important, I think what has emerged in the last few days and what it came out of the SB conclusion and what will be governed next week, this week actually on Friday as we close COP27, is that we do have a clear roadmap, that there is still a lot of work to be done. There is still a lot of consultations to be undertaken, and there is still space to expand the participation and the inclusion of more ideas and, and greater impetus in terms of how not only we analyze where we are, but most importantly, start identifying opportunities and solutions that can allow us to get to the 1.5 desire that we have. So in the SB conclusions, most importantly, is that we have laid out, a roadmap. As I said, in March, there will be an additional workshop that will be organized. It's going to be a hybrid workshop allowing for broad-based participation. And I would say that the process that has been established through the technical dialogue process has been quite inclusive. And if you've talked to different parties, different non-party stakeholders, of course, there is still a scope for improvement in terms of how we have been able to deliver and support the processes of inclusion throughout the processes. But again, there are moments that have been provided. So the March workshop will be one. We will be opening up again for inputs for parties, non-party stakeholders, and really it's my role really to encourage all of you to engage not only in the submission of inputs, but also in their analysis opportunities for dialoguing, for more critical analysis, for checking the credibility of information and data that is being inputted in the portal will be also critical for you as a role. And then, of course, the SB 57, which again, 56, 57, 58, which will be in Bonn. And then again, a second workshop in October before we arrive in Dubai for COP28 to launch the first global stocktake. So there is a breadth of opportunities for your inputting into the process. I would like to highlight a couple of things, that I think are very critical even in this, as we move towards Dubai. I think the complexity of the process has been created even further, and I think it's also a great opportunity by the need for us to also find ways that we can provide linkages to the mitigation, other work programs, like the mitigation work program. We have the global goal on adaptation. We have the new quantified goal on finance. This is work that is ongoing and that will be critical to ensure that we have this comprehensible global stocktake, but that we also benefit from the work that's ongoing in these other processes. And I think one of the reasons why Herad and Farhan here in Sharm el-Sheikh organized one extra roundtable that was looking at these interlinkages and the need for an integrated approach is critically to ensure that we don't lose that opportunity. The timeframes, of course, differ, and that's really going to be our role in terms of ensuring that the methodologies, the approach, the assessment of and the credibility of the process is very well linked, will be very important for us and you to work together to ensure that those processes inform each other and do not overlap or are not misaligned. So the alignment, the synergy will be increasingly crucial. And I think really what I'm looking forward to also going forward is also to see how the work you are doing, the work that parties are also leading in various processes, both at the technical level, influence and unlock the political messaging. So, and this is really what we were discussing yesterday at the side event. How can we unlock now the political layer? A lot of work has been going on technically, but in order for us to have more impetus and more impact and to ratchet that ambition, then the political layer becomes important. But that political layer needs to be informed, again, by robust, credible science. Equity has to be at the center of it, and the political messaging needs to respond to the various needs, the gaps, but of course also identify opportunities and create those synergies for everybody to benefit from that. So in the year ahead, we will be providing those opportunities, again, to work much closer with you. And I think I would just like to repeat again what we said at yesterday's event, that a successful GST can only happen when we successfully and honestly provide an inclusive platform, an inclusive opportunity for everybody to participate, to own it. And therefore, when we go into the how, from the what to the how, and towards implementation, that we are all part and parcel of it, feel included, and can participate not only in the first global stocktake, but going on forward to ensure this comprehensive approach that would have meaning and have a transformational impact and effect everywhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Cecilia. You've laid out a lot of guidance for this group to help with the two meetings, March and October, to bring in informed ideas and thoughts, clear roadmaps, consultations, to help with the inclusion part and to help with the political process. So let's see what our teams, our partners here have to offer for now, in terms of reflections that are coming in based on their participation in the technical dialogues. So the next 15 minutes, we're going to have a panel with 4 speakers that are listed here. So I'd like to first call on Enrique from ICM to give us his reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Surabi, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm coordinating within the IGST, the Latin America and the Caribbean region, and And I'm happy to share some thoughts about how this technical dialogue has been done in the last couple of months. We have a first series of meetings and dynamics in the bond session in June this year. And under this principle of learning by doing, there was a lot of creativity when it comes to the different dynamics that we could do. I think that the co-facilitators have been doing a really good job in trying to bring innovation in the ways that we interact and collect all the information that is there. Of course, submissions, of course, different meetings. That was actually very useful, but the innovation around world cafes, breakout groups, and I think that at this session we have seen some improvements in some hand with more dynamics, especially when it comes to the breakout groups in the roundtables. I think that was actually something very useful, allowing for a lot of interaction. I think that was something very, very good in terms of ensuring that everyone could actually engage, and especially non-state actors. I think at that point, at least to my experience, there was no distinction between parties and non-party stakeholders at the breakouts, at the World Cafe, and all of that has been captured in an effort from the Secretariat. A second point is about the submissions themselves. Over 90% of the submissions that are actually presented to the technical dialogues or before the technical dialogues are actually submitted by non-party stakeholders. So I think that is also another way to show, in line with what Cecile was saying, that the importance and the level of engagement that civil society is having at this technical dialogue. Finally, I think that it is important to thank and welcome all the recognition that we have seen from the Secretariat, the openness of the Secretariat to allow the participation of non-party stakeholders, and also the welcoming that we receive from not only from the co-facilitators of the technical dialogues, but also the co-chairs of the joint contact groups. And I think that is something that is a really good practice. It doesn't always happen in all avenues of negotiations. So it's actually important and I think remarkable to maintain that, especially in the way forward for next year when we are actually entering the last phase of this technical dialogue, taking advantage of the regional climate weeks, for instance, like it happened this year in Santo Domingo, in my region, and of course in the others, and trying to capture all those opportunities. So as remarks, I would just leave it there, and so thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Enrique. That was perfect timing. Now let's move on to Tambe from the Africa Climate and Environmental Foundation.
Thank you very much for the floor. Tambe Honorine Eno, and I'm representing my organization, Africa Climate and Environment Foundation. I would like to begin by thanking the ClimateWorks Foundation for giving me an opportunity to speak on this panel, and also for bringing some of my youths. They actually sponsored 6 youths from grassroots communities to follow the GST dialogue. I mean, this is something that is not common, and this really is a clear indication that they really want youths to be involved in things like this. Throughout the discussions or the technical dialogue of the GST, there was a common use of the word inclusivity. But how inclusive is this process? Where are the youths and where are the grassroots communities? If ClimateWorks Foundation had not brought those youths to that event, we would probably not have typical grassroots youths at the event. We would not have African youths at that following this dialogue. So where is the place of the youths? Where is the place of grassroots communities? You know, a process like this that is that calls for accountability and transparency should have a lot of attention, especially from youths that would bear the brunt of the impact in future. But you do not see them here. You can even look in the audience. You will not see youths seated here. It's not because they are not interested, but they are not aware of what's going on. They are not aware of the process, and they are not aware of how much they can contribute in the process, and the fact that they can actually hold their leaders accountable through this process. How can they call for transparency? How can they call for accountability if they are not aware? So I think to an extent, we civil societies are also failing because we are not raising awareness as much as we should in the process. If we look at other things or areas of interest like the loss and damage, you see so much attention on it. You see people going on the streets demonstrating, and of course when you go on the street demonstrating, it calls for attention and our leaders will have to take action towards it. But you don't see anything like this for the GST. You know, so I think it would be great if we as civil society actors can also see how to raise awareness on this topic so that youths, especially those in the grassroots community, can be aware of the process and start holding their governments accountable or start asking for inclusion in the process in their countries. There are a lot of youths at grassroots communities that have been very active implementing local technologies to address climate change adaptation and mitigation issues in their countries. But it's very obvious that their technologies will not be reflected in their country's report, their country's GST report. Why? Because most countries, especially in the global south or developing countries, who focus on nationwide projects or actions, they will not give room for grassroots communities and youth-led initiatives. And so the report, we are not even sure if it's going to be, if it's going to include the works of grassroots communities and of youths. So if these youths are aware that they actually have a place or a role to play in this, and if we can give them the power to actually hold their governments accountable by raising awareness and providing them with the necessary support or capacity building to be able to collect data, analyze data, and report to their governments, I think the process will be more inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tambe. I think that was really nice to highlight the importance of inclusiveness to build up that accountability. So let me move on to Ana Perez from IDRI to share her reflections.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thanks for the invitation. So I've counted the hours we spent in the Global Stocktake. It was 23 hours, and I'm not counting the poster session or the more art setting that was also going on with the different events. So that shows the importance of the process, right, and how much, let's say, the Secretariat, the Presidency has decided to put effort into that, which is great. I agree. I will build in Enrique's point on how the more informal setting really helped further the discussions. I think if we look at the content of what was discussed in this session compared to Bonn, is way more interesting, more deep. We had parties and non-parties, of course, sharing best practices, examples from the countries. That's very powerful. And here I think we have to really thank the role of non-party stakeholders, not only for the submissions that, of course, as Enrique was saying, played a great role, and we were the majority doing that, but also of the experts that were there, the scientists, the youth, in this case, of making this conversation more deep, more engaging. One of the reflections that I was sharing the other day as well is that we've seen a lot of disengagement on sharing best practices, and that's great, but there's two legs, right, in the Global Stocktake. One is we are looking at how to enhance ambition, and we are also looking at how to increase international cooperation. And that's a difficult part, right? Like, we are not very sure yet how we are doing the international cooperation part. It didn't come as much in the discussions, and I hope this is something that we will pick up in the third dialogue, that we will pick up also in the consideration of outcomes in the more political part. But yeah, I think we can also say we are very happy with the outcome of the joint contract group. The fact that we can kickstart a bit this political discussion, make sure that we have enough time to prepare for that, And I'd say as non-party stakeholders, we are really looking forward to provide inputs to that. For example, how will this process will be designed, how the tables will be set up, because of course there's the table that's already in October, that's late in the process, right? Like what would that table be discussing? Or how do you choose the topics? Right? I was saying there's a broad range of topics. It has been super interesting to see all these emerge, but how do you now pick some? So I think non-party stakeholders, we have a lot to say on how to choose that, how to help emerge the most important issues. My vision is that they will be linked to specific transformations where we can cooperate, and that's why I was linking international cooperation. So I hope we see some of this in the consideration of outputs. And maybe my positive message is that this is one of the issues that more or less, except for some details, we're happy about, right? Like we are happy of the inclusivity, on how the process went. So let's use this, let's highlight this in the final outcome of this COP. Let's make sure that we are building on this momentum for the Global Stocktake. It's like one of the positive stories of this COP. Let's hope there are many more, but I think we can say that this is one of the ones. So yeah, looking forward to see how it evolves, and that's it from me.
Thank you. I hope the process and that international engagement part works well. So let's move on to the last panelist in this session, Julian from Climate Action Network.
So thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation, for having me on this panel. So I will be speaking on behalf of CAN, the Climate Action Network, and there are just 3 points that I want to make. So first is that on the part of CAN, we recognize and appreciate the improved inclusivity of TD 1.2 as compared to TD 1.1 in Bonn. So this time around in Sharm el-Sheikh, we noticed and observed that non-party stakeholders, observers could participate more openly and freely in the various discussions, in the roundtables, the world cafes, and so on, and could more freely and openly make inputs and contributions. And we really appreciate that. And also on the part of CAN, we also appreciate that the co-facilitators of the technical dialogue had taken on board feedback from non-party stakeholders and observers when designing TD 1.2. So thank you very much for that. And at the same time, while we appreciate the improved inclusivity, we also noticed that perhaps there are some areas for further improvement, notably around translation. So this time around, the discussions were almost exclusively in English, and there was not much translation into other UN languages. And even though this is an African COP, so participants from Francophone parts of Africa may not have been able to participate as fully as they would have liked, and could have been excluded. Both parties and non-party participants could have been excluded because of this language barrier. So then the second point we want to raise is that we noticed that while it's great that this TD 1.2 was so open and inclusive, we also noticed there were very strong presence and participation from certain industries in TD 1.2 who are using this opportunity of the open technical dialogues to promote certain solutions and justifying these solutions based on certain presentations or of certain scientific findings and claims. And we, on the part of CAN, have concerns about maybe potential conflicts of interest if the TD process, the GST process, is being used to promote solutions from which certain participants or organizations stand to profit. And also our concern with potential misrepresentations of scientific findings if, for example, findings are cherry-picked from various scientific reports and IPCC reports and so on and so forth. And so going forward, we could recommend that perhaps there should be more transparency and safeguards around potential conflicts of interest in the overall GST process while maintaining inclusivity. And also we recommend that any scientific claims that are made should be rigorously fact-checked as well. And the final point we want to make is that looking forward towards the consideration of inputs / political phase of the GST, we hope to see continued inclusion of non-party stakeholders. We are encouraged by some of the statements that have already been made, and we will continue to mobilize to ensure that we and our allies will continue to mobilize to ensure that the GST process remains inclusive of non-party stakeholders, of observers, because as has already been mentioned on this panel, we non-party stakeholders can help ensure that parties are accountable and to generate an ambitious outcome from the GST, and this first GST is especially critical to keep 1.5 alive. And today is actually my birthday, and so my hope and wish is for an ongoing inclusive GST process that will result in ambitious outcomes at COP28 that keeps 1.5 alive. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to the panelists for sharing their reflections from their participations in the TD technical dialogues. Now let's just hear from Jamal from WRI on what an impactful global stocktake in 2023 at COP28 would look like. Jamal, over to you.
Thank you so much, and happy birthday, Julian. Thank you so much for having me here. As has been mentioned, the GST1 is set to conclude in the United Arab Emirates next year. And the million-dollar question of what the GST process could deliver is, in fact, on a lot of parties and non-party stakeholders' minds. So I hope in my presentation today I provide some initial thoughts on what imperatives could the global stocktake outcome in the United Arab Emirates embrace, and what are some of those key elements. So perhaps one highlight that I was able to notice at this COP27 is, in fact, the sheer amount of interest that parties and non-party stakeholders are having on the global stocktake, given that it will be a priority for the presidency next year, and then also given the importance of this process in spurring further action. So, as my colleagues have mentioned, while the technical discussions are well underway, it's important to start thinking about what the final political phase of the global stocktake could look like. And as Cecilia has mentioned, parties as well here at COP27, they expressed the interest to start working and having workshops and receiving submissions on the vision for what that final outcome could look like. So what we know, let's start with what we know, is that after the technical assessment, there's going to be a factual synthesis report that is going to summarize all of the different technical discussions that have been happening, starting from June 2022 and ending in June 2023. So after that factual synthesis report is produced, parties will then have the chance to discuss the findings of the synthesis report and find out what's its implications at the political level, right? What are the political implications of the global stocktake? So, simply said, that final component will be the most challenging and probably the most consequential part of the process. It has significant potential to provide valuable information that countries need, and also not just governments, but also non-party stakeholders, on the gaps that remain to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And importantly, what are the opportunities to unlock some of those gaps? How to bridge them? What are some of the critical opportunities that can help us accelerate our action? So the framing of these final outputs is thus of key importance. Now, despite the name of the global stocktake, this process is not only meant to take stock, right? We already know the gaps. We already know that we are behind on several of the thematic areas of the GST. It's not only meant to tell us about those gaps or define them ever more precisely, as the co-facilitators of the technical assessment always remind us, but it also meant to spur countries to take stronger climate action across sectors, across themes, in mitigation, in adaptation. It enhances the provision and mobilization of finance. It improves access to finance, especially from developing countries, to help them advance on their climate agendas. So in order to have an impactful global stocktake, the first thing that we need to think about is that the final outputs need to be politically relevant. The process is quite broad, so we need not be lost, but it needs to be politically relevant of what's happening on the ground. What are countries' challenges? What are some of the opportunities that exist? And it provides us with clear recommendations that can drive climate action in this decade in order to help us get on a 1.5, help us strengthen countries' resilience to climate impacts, and also help support aligned finance there as well. So for today, I'm going to share with you a proposed 7 imperatives that the final output should embrace in order to ensure that the global stocktake is able to generate action on the ground. So number 1, the first imperative, I would say, is on the gaps, right? The global stocktake is still meant to tell us where do we stand, where we are, what are the current gaps. So it's important for it to highlight the emissions gap, the implementations gaps with regards to adaptation on finance, but then push countries to come together and agree on the urgency to tackle those gaps. So number 1, I think it's a fairly easy ask. We already know what are those gaps, but one thing that is important here is that the global stocktake will be one of the first processes or official processes under the UNFCCC to also look at loss and damage, which is quite important. So we'll be looking forward to what the global stocktake will be saying on gaps in relation to loss and damage. Number 2, or imperative number 2, we've done with the gaps, now we need to look at the future. So it's really important that the global stocktake, building on all of the different discussions, all of the useful and valuable discussions that we've had during the technical assessment, to tell us what are the opportunities that exist. The IPCC in many of its reports highlights many of the solutions. For example, if I am to talk about mitigation, they say that solutions that cost under $100 US, if picked up by countries, could halve emissions by 2030. And so it's really important that the GST would provide information to countries on what are some of those actions, and so to help those countries to take them in order to be in line with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think the co-facilitators have been inching towards this in this technical dialogue in particular by pushing parties and non-party stakeholders to think about the how, not just the what. And so I've heard been said that there might be an outcome of a technical annex from the technical assessment, which lays out all of these different options. And so what countries need to do at COP28 when we're talking about the GST is to look at those different solutions and prioritize what are some of those main critical solutions that can unlock action in this critical decade and beyond. So that's point number 2.
Jamal,
point number
Jamal, you have
yes?
2 more minutes to finish the
2 more minutes.
Of the 5.
I'll brush through. Number 3, it's really important to remember that the global stocktake is meant to be conducted in light of equity. And here I want to highlight 2 main points. In light of equity means that it needs to address a balance and a balanced approach to all of the different thematic areas, and also needs to address them in a balanced manner, but also it needs to allow countries or share with countries on how they can improve their understanding of equity. Because once more and more countries are taking equitable action, then they are able to the outcomes of the global stocktake are perceived as more legitimate by all of its different stakeholders. Point number 4, international cooperation. And that is quite broad. So international cooperation can happen within the UNFCCC, outside the UNFCCC. It's been successful in certain parts. It's been not so successful in others. And so it's important for the global stocktake to highlight recommendations for how international cooperation can be strengthened. Number 5, it's important also that the GST is meant to inform countries and NDCs. And so it's important that it provides guidance to countries on how they can improve their NDCs in the coming round, which are expected in 2025. Number 6, it must provide guidance to non-party stakeholders. Non-party stakeholders have been a key element or stakeholders in the Paris Agreement and the achievement of the Paris Agreement. And so we've been seeing quite a lot of different cooperative initiatives such as the GFANs, Race to Resilience, Race to Zero. We need to see how those initiatives can help countries advance their nationally determined contributions and their targets there. And finally, if my last point, for the global stocktake to be impactful, it's important that it would lay the ground for certain measures that it would ensure that the outputs that are at COP28 are taken forward by countries, right? So to set up different measures, whether to encourage conversations at the regional level via regional climate weeks, or whether it would coordinate with other mechanisms that are happening under the UNFCCC, whether on the new finance goal or others. So it needs to lay the ground for what needs to happen next, especially in the next 2 years, in order to help countries again, strengthen their ambition and implementation of the Paris Agreement. So just to end on my final point, everyone has a role to play next year, whether it is parties, non-party stakeholders, businesses, civil society, and it's really important that we all come together to ensure that this process is as impactful as possible.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. So thank you so much. That was well laid out. Let's give a hand to our panelists, and happy birthday to Julian. So we're going to have our panelists leave the stage because we're going to get some more input and reflections from the 4 working groups. But before we do that, I'm very delighted to welcome Jonathan Pershing, who is the Director of the Environmental Program at the Hewlett Foundation. Tambe said thanks to ClimateWorks for the support for hosting the IGST, the Global Stocktake. And we thank Jonathan for his support from the Hewlett Foundation that helped us create these working groups, helped us create this process of inclusion, because without that, we wouldn't have had the funding to support all of that. So I would like to invite Jonathan to share his reflections on the need for non-party stakeholders to help strengthen the stocktake. So Jonathan, over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia.
Thanks so much, Surabi. It's really great to be here, and thanks to all of you for participating. I found that last panel to be remarkably informative, both in terms of the ideas that people are bringing to the discussion, but also in terms of framing some of the roles that civil society might play in the stocktake. I wanted to put a couple of reflections on the table, first about how I see the process, and then secondly, how I think we in philanthropy might support the larger civil society groups as we look at driving this agenda forward. The first comment that I would note is that at the end of the day, the convention and its instruments are essentially normative. There is not a binding consequence if we do or don't comply. Therefore, for each of us, if we're to see countries act on what they've committed, it's on us, on civil society, to hold them to account. And the way we have to do that is multiple. We need to provide enough information. We need to collect it and collate it. We need to object when information is not available. We need to be clear about the adequacy of the response, and we need to provide options that could enhance the response where it is inadequate. We need to recommend things that can work as opposed to things that we'd like to see but may be impractical. And if they're impractical, we need to figure out how to make them work in the future by designing new options that can carry us forward. We need to stand together as a community of practice so we don't have each of us fragmented and finding very marginal benefit in a series of minimal actions, but collective benefit in something that's more coherent that can create change. We need to do this in all countries. We don't want some countries to comply and others to walk away with no real action. That undermines the intent of the agenda and leaves us much less capable of driving the outcomes that we want. We should be clear, this is an integral part of the effectiveness of the regime. It goes back to the beginning in terms of transparency. It goes back to the beginning in terms of the inability to get a compliance mechanism with stringent standards. It is structured around what we collectively as a community are able to persuade governments to do. So if those are the objectives, how do we spend the next year in magnifying our effect? I wanted to pick up on a comment that was made in the last panel. We know the outcome of the stocktake. This is not going to be a surprise. Anyone sitting in this room would be well positioned to evaluate the performance of the country in which they live or the perspectives of the collective adequacy of the aggregate. We are not going to be surprised about the outcome. Emissions have been going up virtually every year since we began the work on the Climate Convention. They should be going down. Very few countries have found ways to drive those emissions down. They have to do more. We have not seen the financial support required being provided. We have not seen an adaptation agenda that is both articulated and supported through developed and developing countries or at the grassroots level. So we can know those things. We can also point to the set of people who are around this conference who are making recommendations, but we have to synthesize them. So what can philanthropy do? In this next year, I would argue that we have to raise our voices. We have to put ourselves in a much more explicit position, not to wait until the conference happens, and certainly not to wait until governments have negotiated their outcomes in order to put ourselves and our views forward. That means working not just when you come to Abu Dhabi next year, but in between now and then, raising everything that you think is critical with the places in which you live, with the governments where you can have direct impact and make change. Very few governments come to these meetings waiting to decide what they intend to do. They come to these meetings with a policy well developed and well formed. At this meeting, they try to figure out, is there any common ground? But we can advance the cause by developing a set of recommendations for them to take with them when they come next year. That's work at home. That's not work here. A protest here is too late. You have to have the protest in country, in capital, with key representatives. Finally, we've got a series of process exercises that await us. We have the opportunity to make further comment and to provide input into the stocktake exercise. If you haven't done so, you should. If you need support to write up the ideas, work with your colleagues who have it, or come to the philanthropic community which perhaps can provide part of that. If we do not raise our voices, if we do not hold the global community accountable, we should not be surprised when they do not act at the level we ask. We should give them advance warning. We should give them clear recommendations. We could give them practical guidelines. And then we should have high expectations for delivery. And after this next year, we should hold them accountable to what they have done and what they have not done. And if they don't deliver, we should come back at them and tell them so. The stocktake is not a one-off exercise. It is an iterative process. We go through it every year. This happens to be elevated with of clear guidelines that are being provided and some discrete inputs that we've agreed to use. But we are not limited to those, and it's on us if we don't meet our commitments. Thank you.
Thank you. Very inspiring. Thank you, Jonathan. Great advice from the former lead negotiator for the US. So let's really listen to all that he said, and also who's now in philanthropy, who has been supporting this process. So thank you so much. So now we're going to go through a panel, a short panel. Thank you. A short panel which is going to cover the 4 working groups of the independent global stocktake: the mitigation, adaptation, equity, and finance. We're going to have brief updates from our 4 panelists, and we're going to go in order: Henry, then Christian, then Sarah, and then Pallavi. So over to you.
Thanks, Surabi, and thanks for having me here on this panel. My name's Henry Neufeldt. I'm head of the Impact Assessment and Adaptation Unit at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. And I'm standing in here for my colleague Jingjing Gao, who's doing most of the work together with the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad in India. So please excuse me if I don't get everything perfectly right. First, this is the 3rd phase of the IGST that we've been working in adaptation. First, working on an in-depth analysis of adaptation in the global stocktake, then looking at the private sector adaptation components within the global stocktake. And this year, we're advancing an understanding of adequacy and effectiveness in adaptation. Now, let me just talk a little bit more about the concept of adequacy and effectiveness in adaptation, because different from mitigation, adaptation is a really fuzzy concept and difficult to assess in terms of progress. So I actually am the chief scientific editor of the GAP reports, the adaptation GAP reports. I have 3 copies here for those who want them. And what we struggle with always is really to find the metrics that help us understand what progress in adaptation can mean. We use proxy metrics on planning, finance, and implementation to tell us something about the progress that is being made. But we know nothing or very, very little about the effectiveness and the adequacy of the actions that are being undertaken. And one of the results of this year's adaptation gap report was that current adaptation practice is really very, very poor. So the work that we're doing in the IGST is supporting the process of enhancing understanding of adequacy and effectiveness, both on a theoretical and on a technical perspective. Theoretically, how is adaptation progressing in terms of adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability, the three components that inform the global goal on adaptation. Operationally, technically, what is the information that's being collected, an assessment, a technical assessment, and the consideration of the outputs of these actions. So bringing these two dimensions together through the Global Stocktake and to inform the global goal on adaptation. And we're using two examples, empirical examples. One is the Gap Track project that is led by IDRI, and two country examples in Ghana and Nigeria to inform that process. And that's where we stand right now. I'll stop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being so perfectly on time as well, Henry. So let's move to Christian to talk about what he's learning from the Equity Working Group.
Okay, thank you. My name is Christian Holz. I work for the Climate Equity Reference Project, and we co-coordinate the Equity Working Group of the IGST. And so just a bit of background, before the IGST started, we actually wrote a paper on how equity would look like in the ideal stocktake. And two things that came out in terms of procedural equity was our observation that that was also mentioned earlier in the first panel, that a good stocktake would have to be balanced in scope, so not just focused on mitigation, like how often these things are, and it would have to be inclusive of both, let's just call them northern and southern perspective. So when we set up the EWG, the Equity Working Group, we made sure to build those two components into the design of the working group, and we do as a result have a majority of southern experts on the working group, and we are mostly focusing on issues other than mitigation. And last year, because that's what I'm asked to report on, in last year we did a few things. We wrote a paper that we call the equity landscape. So it doesn't really set out to rush to any suggestions, but it rather sets out the deep challenges that thinking about equity in the context of a stock-taking exercise like the GST is supposed to do. And again, I guess it's a little bit of a theme for us. Again, it kind of speculates on what a ideal GST would look like. And it goes, and it explicitly and intentionally goes beyond the somewhat restrictive terms of references that Article 14 gives the official GST, and looks at what an independent exercise like the independent global stocktake that runs in parallel but also feeds into the GST could do, let's not say better, like differently maybe than the official GST. And I think so that's I think this is an interesting paper, if I may say so myself, and I think it will be interesting, looking a little bit even further ahead after this global stocktake to see whether parties are still comfortable with the GST process and are maybe interested or at least willing or open to open up some of the rather restrictive terms of references that they gave themselves for the GST around equity, around fair shares, assessment of individual contributions, and these sort of things where they don't want to go at with a 6-foot pole. And another thing that we did for the bond session is a negotiator brief for equity and the global goal, assessing the global goal and adaptation. That was very well received and is identifying core equity questions in assessing the global goal or progress toward the global goal on adaptation. And finally, just 2 weeks before the COP, we did a 2-day virtual expert workshop to try to move the idea of a needs-based assessment for the GST forward. It was called Enabling a Needs-Based and Equitable Climate Regime. And we had sessions on adaptation and climate resilient pathways, on the challenges of thinking through what a needs-based assessment could mean for loss and damage, on international cooperation and finance, and finally on needs-based approaches to fossil fuel phase-out and to development itself. And then finally, because that was just 2 weeks before the COP, essentially with one foot on the plane, we wrote a negotiators briefing based on the outcomes of that workshop on needs-based assessment, because that's an idea we think would be very helpful. And in this briefing, we specifically are trying to, wherever possible, link the points that rose up in the workshop to concrete bits of text and paragraphs and articles of the Paris Agreement, the Convention, and the various CMA and COP decisions around these various issues. So I won't, I don't have time to go into the details, but we have collected all these things on our website at climateequityreference.org/IGST, and we are always very, very interested in feedback on these products. Thank you.
So thank you. Equity is a really important part. So thank you. Let's move on to finance. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Colenbrander, and I lead the Climate and Sustainability Program at ODI. ODI is a think tank that used to be known as the Overseas Development Institute, but that sounds a bit colonial, so we've rebranded. Like Henry, I'm here today representing a more expert colleague, Charlene Watson, who unfortunately couldn't stay for a second week. So again, like Henry, please forgive me if I do not speak precisely to the elements of finance in the Finance Working Group. But what a privilege it is to be part of this network of experts from all over the world contesting what equitable finance looks like and how we can measure it in the process of the GST. You'll all know that finance is a key enabler of climate action. You'll also be very aware that it is the key point of contention in the deliberations. The shortfall to the 100 billion goal, how big the new collective quantified goal should look. Is there ever going to be funding for loss and damage? And so to be sense-checking these questions with the Finance Working Group is an extraordinary privilege. Acting as an open civil society partnership, the Finance Working Group has, over the last few years, brought together a range of expert perspectives from countries at all levels of income. And we focused on two really contentious topics. The first one is this question of the provision and mobilization of climate finance from developed to developing countries. That's obviously been the story of the 100 billion goal for the last few years, but increasingly it's the story of the new climate finance goal and the story of loss and damage finance. It's the connective tissue of the UNFCCC. It's the political will and solidarity, and its lack thereof is hindering conversations even now in Sharm. So what have the Finance Working Group done about this? I've always been struck, as someone who's not a member of the group, by how far ahead of the curve they are in the research that they're doing. The Finance Working Group have published thoughts and ideas on what loss and damage funding arrangements should look like, 2 years before that ever made it onto the agenda at COP. They've published papers on accessing finance, which is only just the subject of the deliberations of the new collective quantified goal last week. And they're exploring how a variety of financial instruments should be employed at a moment when we have very hard conversations around us about the role of indebtedness and how climate finance fits against the pressures that developing countries in particular are facing. In doing this work, the Finance Working Group hopes to deepen conversations specifically around climate finance as it happens within the UNFCCC processes and commitments, hoping to stimulate parties and other actors involved in programming to step up in advance of this first GST. In particular, we focused on quality, knowing that there is a very live debate around quantity happening without our inputs. The second theme this working group has really focused on is this underappreciated clause in the Paris Agreement called Article 2.1c. Anyone familiar with that one? Couple of nodding heads, few nodding heads. Article 2.1c is one of the 3 long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. The first one on mitigation, the second on adaptation, and the third, 2.1c, on pledging that all flows of finance should ultimately be consistent with low carbon and climate resilient development pathways. If we have any negotiators in the room, you'll know that this particular clause snuck into the Paris Agreement a few hours before it was signed, and so it hasn't had the depth of debate of some of the other clauses about how exactly to operationalise it. The Finance Working Group has been a real pioneer on this front, working with 10 countries around the world to set up a benchmark on how climate consistent their finance is so far, so that they can measure against it in the global stocktakes to come. So looking forward, we're using all of those resources to start to define success, as Christian was alluding to, in the GST in 2023. Please do come to the ClimateWorks Foundation website for a whole bunch of thought provokers and case studies, and particularly a clear line of sight through to how this information needs to be fed into the GST from the IGST. Thank you, Surabi.
Thank you, Sarah. And now let's move to the last working group on mitigation and have Pallavi come online.
Good evening, everyone. This is Pallavi. I work with the Low Carbon Pathways team at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I am part of the mitigation working group, and we are coordinating with UMD for this. And I'm representing also one of my colleagues who isn't here. So very much in the same boat as everyone else, but looking forward to my intervention here. So mitigation has been in the climate debate for a long time. Many of us are aware of many of the techno-economic indicators of mitigation. For example, the potential of renewable energy, the deployment, their costs. So we wanted to do something a little new at the mitigation working group. And that's why we picked up not the techno-economic aspect, but other aspects of the mitigation discourse that really need to come into the front for us to really take action at the stocktake. So over the last year, we have had 2 roundtables, one on political economy and one on capacity building. 2 very, very important aspects for us to take action on mitigation. On the political economy, we've already submitted our paper and published it, and we explore multiple indicators and dimensions of how the political economy can be measured. The idea is that even though these are slightly abstract concepts, we want to understand if there are ways to put some kind of measurement on them so that we can track them. Otherwise, it becomes very, very difficult to track something this abstract. So the effort of the mitigation working group has been that, and along with the political economy paper, we are currently working on the capacity building paper that will look at multiple aspects of capacity building. It will look at institutional capacity, procedural capacity, capacity for reporting, and many of these things. So we'll have that very soon, and of course all of this will be available on the website, so we can very well check that. Last but not the least, this is what we are looking forward to do from here on. As we discussed at Bonn, the mitigation working group is putting together a one-of-its-kind early career scholars for an inclusive global stocktake. And the aim of this program is to get the best of the minds that are available and create cutting-edge research in the global stocktake process, so that this process can have a lot more knowledge and depth. So we are launching this today officially. We've been giving a lot of hints during the Bonn meetings, and I'm very happy to say that after a lot of internal discussions, through all the logistics and the content and all of that, we are finally ready to put it out. So I'm super happy. I would like to really thank Shannon. She's been really after this. So Shannon, thank you so much on this. The idea of this, to put together this program, is primarily to make sure that we have young voices coming into the global stocktake. And because this is not the first time, we are going to have it again and again. We want to have a community that is confident, that is clear, and that knows the gaps and fills it as required for the coming stocktakes. So we are very happy to do that. And last but not the least, I think it has been an
extreme pleasure for me to be part of this panel and share all these awesome things that we at the Mitigation Working Group have put together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Exciting that you had this launched. So, yeah, we can give them a hand. So we heard a bit of reflections from the 4 different working groups: equity, finance, mitigation, adaptation. We also heard earlier there are plenty of gaps everywhere, but for us, for the Stocktake, it's important to translate the gaps to action. And for that, as we heard, because of the non-binding nature of the Paris Agreement, that to build up that accountability is really, for us to do that, we have to collect the information, use that collect it in an inclusive way, and use that to push for more action. And all of the reflections you heard here from the working groups and from those in the earlier panel who were part of the technical dialogue, all of that is helping us build a momentum and use that in several moments through all of next year in order for us to have a more successful Stocktake in November in Dubai. Now we're not done. We just have a few more minutes with the 4 panelists. They just shared their reflections and highlights from the various working groups they've been in charge of with their partners, because many of their partners were not here today. But we just have a couple of questions for our panelists, and we're going to hear their reflections and then open it up a little bit for Q&A if we have enough time. So I know we had prepared 2 questions for our panelists, but in the interest of time, I might just stick to one, sort of a combined version, which is you heard from our participants who were part of the technical dialogue, a lot of attention needed to bring in the local, the national, and the regional contributions so that all of that could be collected and reflected in what we want to be a robust political engagement process that needs to be there in order for us to really have that good process in place to keep to temperature targets. So in your perspective, from the work you've each been leading, how might a more bottom-up approach to get all of this help you strengthen what you do and help us strengthen the global Stocktake? So I'm just going to go in this in line with Sarah, then Henry, then Pallavi, and then with Christian. Over to you, Sarah.
Oh, I thought I had a minute while someone else answered, but that's okay. I can give it a shot. I said I thought we would go in a different order, but I think I can handle it.
Okay.
So I'm going to go back to the example I was talking about before with the work that we're doing on Article 2.1c and supporting these 10 countries to think through what it means to have climate-consistent finance. And I think the really striking thing has been the diversity of countries that we have worked with in this process. So the conversation that somewhere like Switzerland has, one of the world's great financial powerhouses about climate-proofing its finance flows, looks pretty different from Indonesia, where public finance is, firstly, there's not that much money in the system, relatively, and then public finance is very inextricably tied to coal jobs and coal power, although that might change based on the Just Energy Transition Partnership announced today. All the way through to Rwanda, which remains an overwhelmingly agricultural economy in one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. And what we've seen there is that the IGST process produced a consistent framework with 4 key pillars that countries could use to think about the extent to which their finance was consistent. Hope I can remember them all. There was public finance, public spending, tax, financial regulation, and information instruments. And basically, you could look across all of these and see whether the overall incentives you had set up in your economy were aligned with climate change, were aligned with your climate goals. And what we found using this framework in all 10 case studies was that the framework was flexible and could be adopted by different countries, but you ended up with radically different priorities and recommendations. And so that process of having national buy-in and also sub-national buy-in, because we were talking to development banks and individual financial institutions and pension funds, really allowed you to tease out what a country-specific climate-consistent finance pathway might look like, but also come back and feed into the community around what it looked like under each of those 4 pillars. So I think that process of local, national and regional contributions to the Stocktake, as long as you provide some guiding direction and some frameworks at the beginning to to ensure that there is an opportunity to talk across silos and boundaries has proven invaluable for our own conversations, and we hope that the IGST sends that lesson onto the GST with the 2.1c article.
So thank you. That looks complicated, and I'm glad you're doing it for us. Henry, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So also in line with what Sarah was just saying, that you need something like a national framework to operationalize your understanding of adaptation and progress in adaptation. However, when a national government starts with these processes, for instance, through the national adaptation plans, they develop their strategies and understand better what they want to do in terms of adaptation and how to measure their progress in adaptation. They soon come to the point where they have to realize that the impacts of climate change are happening on the ground, of course, and the losses and damages that are experienced on the ground need to be accounted for in one way or the other. So having this national to local level integration is absolutely critical for assessing the progress in adaptation. And this is where bottom-up initiatives and this experience from local non-state actors, non-party stakeholders is absolutely critical to understanding the progress that is being made or not being made in that case. So structuring this around a national framework to enabling local stakeholders to participate in this process through multi-stakeholder platforms or other forms of engagement that give a voice to local stakeholders in all the sectors, across in a vertical and a horizontal way, is absolutely essential to providing the richness and the granularity of adaptation action or inaction, and the gaps that exist between the plans and the actual outcomes, and then also informing the national governments what it is they need to do differently in order to make these changes happen. So it's a dialogue that happens in all directions and is absolutely entirely essential to a successful global stocktake. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for your remarks. Pallavi?
Yeah. So I would think that a bottom-up kind of analysis is very critical. The primary reason being that many of the actions will need to be taken on the ground, and only when we have a bottom-up kind of approach, we have more granular data, we have better understanding of the gaps, of the implementation challenges, and of country circumstances and regional circumstances. And only when we have a better understanding of all of these things is that we can have a better representation of these in the stocktake. So it's extremely important to have this kind of bottom-up approach. But I would also like to say, apart from a bottom approach, we'll also need to have an integrated approach. So we just can't do top-down and bottom-up. There has to be both, so that we kind of meet midway and we have the plus points from both of these. And also cross-sectoral kind of dialogues, so that we are not looking at silos and we are kind of coordinating action, coordinating data gaps, because there may be some gaps that are there, let's say, in the transport sector, may also be there in the industry sector, and we'll try to somehow need to bridge these. So we definitely need a bottom-up, but also a kind of a top-down look. Thank you.
Okay, great. Christian.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So my brain might be a little bit like biased by the needs-based workshop and paper that we just been doing, but I think thinking about like bottom up and national, regional, local, whatever stock takes. I think for like if you want to think about the stock take as through a needs-based approach, I think pretty much by definition you kind of have to go bottom up. It's kind of hard to imagine how you would do a needs-based assessment any other way, properly anyway. And so So maybe to just share like something that came up during our workshop as an example, it was shared that apparently, I mean, yeah, I think we all know that apparently it is a common experience of developing countries that an MDB or an external consultant or whatever runs their own models and then goes to the developing country and says, hey, we figured out what your needs are, here you go, here's our report. And that might or might not actually reflect the actual needs of that country or that community. So local or national, regional, stock-taking exercises, especially if done through a needs-based lens, could help and articulate, especially if done right and resourced properly, could help with articulating these needs. I guess they could even, feed 3 birds with one stone, as the saying goes, or at least as it should go. First, to build capacity to be able to articulate needs, because that's often lacking. That's why the MDBs do, and others do that. Second, to actually then articulate those needs, and then there was the third one. I swear. Well, and provide the learning by doing opportunity, and the co-facilitators have been, stressing that a bunch of time. That one of the and Enrique, I think, mentioned it in the first panel that one of the potential benefits of the GST is this learning by doing. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have some time to take questions from our audience who is still here, which is great. And if you wanted any questions, not just to our panelists here, but also to the ones who are still here in the room who spoke earlier, I think I can see a couple of you are here. So if people had questions, please raise your hand, and Casey here can help with the mic. No questions? Okay. Vaibhav. Thank you for...
Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I had in the last part of the discussion, we talked about the importance of the bottom-up approach. I'm just wondering, I know in theory it really works, or nobody will disagree with it in principle. What does it mean in practice? Whatever approaches we have tried in practice of bottom-up, the transaction costs are unimaginable. You are essentially talking about finding those leaders in like community level, you're talking about a very different architecture altogether. So I understand nobody will disagree in principle about the importance of bottom-up, but wouldn't practically speaking, it still flows down, top-down, not in terms of hard regulation, but in terms of smart nudges, incentives, but still it is happening at that sort of level. And then of course individuals respond to those nudges, those incentives and everything. So it's a sort of a challenging opinion to this whole debate on bottom-up approaches in a big way. So how do we define bottom-up approaches is very important for us to understand the transaction costs and those kinds of things. Happy to understand any perspective on this comment. Yes, thank you.
That's a great question. Would anyone from our panel like to speak, or also from the previous panel? Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, Vaibhav, I completely agree with what you're saying. The transaction costs are very hard, and all of the work that I think CW does in India at the ground level, we ourselves are finding it very challenging. So in theory, of course, it's much easier to agree on it, but in practice that's difficult. But I would still say that even though we don't have a very extensive bottom-up approach, we could still have examples and success stories. I think those can somehow play a good role in showcasing some of these. So we need not need to do a complete overhaul, but even if we can do in bits and patches, that's, I think, will be helpful. Thank you.
Sort of the randomized approach, right? Test things different places, use that, because it's impossible to do it otherwise, but you have to. Henry, yeah, please.
Yes, thanks. It's a challenging question, I think, and if you look at it from an effectiveness perspective, you might think, okay, so it's really expensive to bring all these people together. And you got to do it at different levels, you know, national, subnational, district, municipality, for instance. I think at the same time, if you don't do it, your chances of developing technical solutions that miss the outcomes and do not address the challenges and the problems on the ground can be much, much more expensive in the longer term. Yes, so on the adaptation side, it's clear that the impacts or the avoided impacts happen on the ground. So you need those voices in the first place. On the mitigation side, if I may expand in that direction a little bit, it's somewhat different, but you still have winners and losers. You still have vested interests. You have power relations. And if you do not have the voices of the local communities or indigenous peoples or disadvantaged groups, you are creating what we would call maladaptation, or you could create situations where elite capture of resources leads to very unjust outcomes. And we need to have a climate or a just transition to low emissions, climate resilient development. It's the only way to have long-term success and buy-in. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else wants to take a shot? Christian here.
Well, maybe like one more thought. I think that saying to do like a bottom-up thing doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it like everywhere. I think that if you just start with it, you will then learn some transferable lessons that you can then transfer. That's why they're transferable lessons, I guess. Because sometimes like communities are in similar situations, and I think that is this learning from each other is that then lets you lower your transaction costs or whatever the concept is that you want to apply.
Okay. I think a mix of randomized approaches, best practices, and especially depending on the context, some require more in-depth in process and exploration. If there are, yes, please go ahead with your question. Casey's coming up to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Niklas Wagner from University of Bonn and I've been following as well the GST. Unfortunately I missed part of this panel, but I've been there for the first part and I did not hear so much about the creative part of GST, which is something very new to the whole negotiation space, I feel. Really having some creative inputs as a formal part of the negotiations, and I'm really wondering how the panelists reflect upon this. Like, how useful is this? What kind of role does art, theater, videos, and other kinds of paintings have in creating an effective global stocktake? And how can we improve upon this, or is this not useful at all? And should we skip it? I'm really wondering and curious, and hope that we have some interesting discussions about this. Thank you.
Anyone brave enough to answer the creative exploration part?
I'm going to just do a partial answer.
Okay, great.
Primarily because I'm wildly uncreative myself, nothing like a good report as far as I'm concerned. But something that I've really appreciated about the IGST process is that we have a huge amount of encouragement and flexibility from ClimateWorks Foundation to be experimental, to try and reach a broader audience. So I jest, but ODI does love its reports. That's our go-to all the time. And under the space of the IGST, we've been working much more to experiment with sort of a range of videos, a range of infographics and other digital art to change up our events so that we have creative injections to kick off events and so on when we're trying to do dialogues. And we have found that I'm not sure that it's necessarily attracted a much broader audience, because ultimately when you're talking about finance, people tend to shut down unless it's contesting the failure of the 100 billion goal, which just wakes everyone up. But we have found that it's sparked much richer and more creative conversations about solutions, as opposed to this fixation on barriers and obstacles and limitations, which is so often where the finance conversation gets stuck. So that's not necessarily to say how that will play out for the GST itself, but certainly in the IGST process, I feel that we've been able to be more creative and more provocative by using a wider range of mediums.
Great. Do you have any suggestions yourself, or?
Oh, yeah, it works, sorry. I was thinking that, to me, it's a great exploration what they are doing, right, with the creative space, and also how they are capturing. Have you seen, right, that some of the conversations are captured in a visual way, which is really great. I realized, though, that it's difficult to have this interaction with the negotiators. So yeah, we have time and we go to look at these things and we love it and so on. And I think, it has a very, I was saying it was a great value, but sometimes it was like, I'm not sure where it is, or maybe I don't have time to go, and so on. So how do you bring it closer? Like, I was thinking about this before, like, it would be great if you enter just in the halls and there was like art on the GST. I'm of course exaggerating, but I think it could be more visible, and that would make it easier to access. I was presenting a poster, and of course it's like 2 hours and you speak with whoever you can, and so I think, let's bring that. If the co-facilitators are also happy with it, let's bring it even closer to the normal, more boring, let's say, process.
Yeah, I think that's important, and we want to use this to inspire action, right? Because that's the only way we could do it. All right. So, did someone want to speak? We have time. Go ahead.
Well, when you asked the question, I have to admit that I have not seen any of those creative outputs. I have seen the visuals, like note-taking things, and they're cool. But I was cast back to I think it was the Fiji Bonn COP, where parties were like thinking about designing the global stocktake, and there was a common point made by parties that they wanted to be the global stocktake and its outputs to be more inclusive to different audiences, to a broader group of people who are maybe not the report reading crowd. So I think in that sense, I think it's just it would be interesting to try and figure out which communities particular were meant by those interventions, and then ask them whether it worked for them. But I think that at least it is an indication that that people have been listening to and trying to address those thoughts.
Great. So we might try some creative approaches both in the April and October lead up, if it works out. So I would, if there are no more questions, I think we can end this panel. I'd like to thank all of you for your great inputs. We all share the same goal to discuss and help realize an inclusive stocktake that takes into account all of the non-party input and the work that has been going on for a few years now to really help create that accountability for the global stocktake. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of the partners who've been working on it, and especially Casey and Josefina from ClimateWorks, who've been helping build this for many years at ClimateWorks. And we were like, why are you doing this? But they've been working every year to help create the community. And thanks to the community for working with us to help create this robust process. So thank you, everybody.